Thank you very much for your presence today for our special presentation, The Life and Times of St. Patrick with Sean Murphy. We are about to begin, and I would like to officially welcome everybody to this special virtual event presented by the Holyoke Public Library in partnership with Holyoke Media. I am Johan Rashivega, and it is our pleasure to welcome all of you today in this presentation, The Life and Times of St. Patrick with Sean Murphy. This talk will look into the historical record based on available facts and accepted understandings and examine the historical context of Patrick's mission in Ireland. About our guest today, Sean Murphy, born and raised in Dublin, he came to Cape Cod in 2005. He holds a bachelor's and master's degrees from Trinity College Department of Economic and Social Studies and also a degree in mathematics and physics from London University. He has a passion for his homeland and loves to share his knowledge and interest about his heritage through classes, workshops, and conversation. With this, I think we are ready to begin. And I want to welcome and thank Sean Murphy for being here with us today.
Thank you, Lohan, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here with you, and happy St. Patrick's Day, a day early. So let's get down to it then. It's going to take about an hour, and as Lohan said, I'm going to give you the historical background. It's titled The Life and Times. So I'm going to talk about St. Patrick. I'm going to talk about the times in which he lived, because his work was done as a result of specific historical events, and I'm going to lay those out for you. And at the end, then I would welcome any comments, any questions that you may have. Obviously, I'm doing this in an hour. There's a lot to cover. So some of it has been, if you like, made short, and it lacks in some detail, but you can get a copy of the presentation, and there are a lot of references that I have that you can follow through on. So that being said, I'll move straight away to my screen share. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint presentation with you. That would be available to you, as I said, if you so wish. So I'm going to start off with a quote from St. Patrick. He says, "I am Patrick, a sinner, most uncultivated, and least of all the faithful, and despised in the eyes of many." And that was around the year 460. So I'll be unpacking that for you. Obviously, the original of this would have been in Latin or Irish, not in English, but that's a good translation. So I'm going to introduce you a little bit to his family, because we generally don't hear that much about them when we're talking about St. Patrick. And again, this is a very edited down version of it, but it'll give you a sense of where he stands. So the first thing is, his name wasn't Patrick and he wasn't Irish. His name was Maewyn Sacat Patricius, and the Patricius refers to the patrician order in Rome. And once you reach a certain status, you get that, and it's really from the Patricius that he would have had the name. And when he was in Ireland, he would have been known as Pádraig, because Patrick is the anglicization of the Irish word. He was from a Romano British Christian missionary family, because remember, the Romans first arrived on the island of Britain about 50 years BC, and did some deals, came back about 100 years later and invaded and took over, and remained there till the year 410, when they withdrew their remaining forces from there as a result of the invasions coming from the Germanic tribes and their attempts to, if you like, control the border. Patrick is known as the Apostle of Ireland, and he's the primary patron saint of Ireland, along with Saint Bridget and Columba. We're not sure where he was born. There is a belief that he was born in Kilpatrick near Dumbarton in Scotland around the year 385. Some people say it was Wales. In his writings, he actually tells us that it was in the village of Banaventa, Bernier, but no one has ever been able to locate that and tie it down to a particular place, because as you can imagine, if they could, that would be a serious place for people to visit. So his parents were Calpurnius and Conchessa. They were part of the wealthy Romano-British living in Britain. Calpurnius' father was a deacon, and his grandfather, Petitus, was a priest. Now, there's evidence that some of his siblings and their offspring worked alongside him in Ireland, and I'll just refer to a few of them. One of them was Saint Mel of Ardagh, and his brothers Melchu, Munis, and Rioch. And they are said to have accompanied their uncle Patrick to Ireland. We're not sure if the others accompanied him or came independently. Probably the most famous of them all is Dorarca. Now, she is known as the sister of St. Patrick, but there is some debate as to whether the sister was a blood sister or a sister in religion. We're not sure. But in any event, she's known as the mother of saints because most of her children, 17 sons and 2 daughters, entered the religious life. Many of them became saints and bishops, and so she is famous from that point of view. On the 22nd of March, next week, she will be honoured. She's the patroness of Valentia Island, which is off the coast of County Kerry. Saint Mel is another person of significance. He is said to have helped to evangelize in Ireland while supporting himself through manual labour. And that's significant because, as I'll be explaining a bit later, the Roman Church became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And from that time on, there was a different strategy in terms of conversion. In the first 3 centuries, most of it was done by people traveling around. They were the Christians in the first 3 centuries had a rough time. They were being persecuted, and they were evangelizing among the masses of people. Now, once the Christian church, the Roman church, became the official religion of Rome, the strategy changed. And the idea then was to convert the leaders of society. The idea being that if you convert the leaders, they will just tell all of their people who live under them that they are now of this religion. That was the idea. And there was divisions within the church because a lot of people wanted to retain the original character where people did work and people were manual laborer type of people or whatever. So the significance of his choice here was he was one of those people who said, we will never be a burden on the people. He was appointed by Patrick as one of the earliest Irish bishops, and he was head of the famous diocese of Ardagh, where the Ardagh chalice comes from. He was also involved in the building of the monastery of Ardagh when he was both bishop and abbot, because we had 2 parallel systems running. We had the diocesan parish system that Rome was trying to impose, and then we had the monastic system. And it wasn't until the year 1111 that the diocesan parish system essentially replaced the monastic system. Patrick, in his lifetime, tried as much as he could to get that diocesan parish system, because that was the model from Rome. But the situation in Ireland was such that that really didn't work. He famously accepted St. Bridget's profession as a nun, and he served as her mentor while she was in Ardagh. What's significant about that, of course, is that St. Bridget would have had experienced a lot of difficulty getting anybody who was prepared to essentially support her becoming a nun. And in this case, she became a bishop, because what happened was St. Mel used what they call the form that was appropriate for essentially elevating people to the level of bishop. And when this was pointed out to him, his response was very simple. He said, "Oh, that wasn't a mistake. that was God intervening directly. And he said, I am not going to change that, because to do that would be to go against God's wishes. And until the year 1111, the successors of St. Bridget participated in all of the synods of the church. But again, in 1111, when the Roman system finally replaced the monastic system, one of the casualties of that was the tradition of having a woman bishop. St. Mel has a feast day on February the 7th. It's observed as a holiday for single people, a day for singles to celebrate the good things about being single. And you do things like send yourself a card and have a party for all of your single friends. So that was just a quick run through. There's a lot more, obviously, and some of it you can get from the references I have. So let's have a look at Patrick then. We know that Patrick was a slave, and he came to Ireland first as a slave, and he escaped. So we'll look at that. Now, how do we know that? Well, the closest we have to an autobiography is the Confessio, which St. Patrick wrote in the age when he was about in his early 70s. And we know from that, because he tells us that at the age of 16, he doesn't say it was the year 403 AD, partly because obviously calendars have changed, since. And there are some people who think it was an extra 50 years ahead. But anyway, I go with this, that in today's calendar it was 403. He was captured by Irish pirates from his home in Great Britain and was brought to Ireland, sold as a slave, herding and tending sheep in Dalriada, which was a land in the north of Ireland, up in Antrim. Now, I'll be explaining later why he wrote the Confessio, and that's a very interesting story in itself. Now, the reason he was captured by Irish pirates, if you like, sometimes I put as pirates, but the reality is a bit different. You probably all are aware that the Irish are Celts. Now, where did they come from? Well, the Celts, at least a large number of them at the time of Patrick, were people who had arrived in Ireland after being forced out of Europe by the Romans. So they had no love for the Romans. And then, of course, in the first century, when the Romans took over the nearby island of Britain, there would have been a fear that the next step of the Romans would be to come to Ireland. And they didn't want that to happen. So the strategy was going to the island of Britain and fighting against the Romans there. And one of the things that they did to destabilize the Roman settlements was to go and raid the settlements and take away as prisoners or as slaves those who were living there. So he was owned by Miliach MacBaun, who was a local king, and he ruled some hills in Antrim. Patrick tells us that on the hills he began to pray. He tells us that he had never before paid much attention to the teachings of his religion. And he actually tells us that he did not really believe in God, and he found priests foolish. But out in the cold, wet, dank weather in Antrim, he began to pray. So that's where he was. That's Slieve Mish or Slamish. That's the legendary first known home of Patrick. The head of Miliach were the O'Flyns, or the people who eventually adopted the name O'Flynn. For about 6 years, critically, between the ages of 16 to 22, they were the years that he would have got an education, the equivalent today of a high school and a college education. Critical if you wanted to become a professional, and critical if you wanted to rise up the hierarchy within the church. So the fact that he missed out on these years of education was something that haunted him for the rest of his life. And we'll talk about that later again. So he endured 6 years. Now, we have a couple of things in Ireland. One is we have a Christian narrative that was written about maybe 100 to 200 years after Patrick died, and it was the origin story. And again, it is embellished in all sorts of ways because they had to. He was made the central character, and there were issues with that because when Patrick arrived in Ireland, there were Irish missionaries, and they did not like the idea that someone was being sent in from Rome to be essentially their boss. and they didn't accept him as their boss. They wouldn't let him work in the areas that was under their control. But when the Roman Church established itself and completed its origin story, they made St. Patrick the head. And they tell us things like this, that he was, because the old stories that were made had to look something like the Old Testament or the New Testament. So things like visions, things like things appearing in your sleep, all these things had to be like St. Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus, all sorts of things like that had to be included. What he says here is that your hungers are rewarded, you're going home. More likely what happened was that at the time in Ireland, the High King was Niall of the Nine Hostages. He was one of the strongest and most widely known leaders in Europe at the time. And he was known for his work against the Romans. He was actually assassinated in the Alps on a mission against the Romans. He wasn't killed by a Roman, though. He was killed by an Irishman, somebody acting on behalf of the king of the province of Leinster. That was unexpected. And also, his death then threw Ireland into essentially chaos. And as a result of that chaos, certain things were possible. Like if you were a slave, you could escape. And that's how my understanding is as to how Patrick was able to escape, because it wasn't that easy for people to escape. For instance, they partnered you with somebody, and if either of you absconded, the other was going to have a rough time. Let's put it that way. So he tells us anyway, he went 200 miles and he got on a boat. Being a fugitive slave, was an issue. You couldn't help them in any way. What he tells us in his work, he says, and we're not sure whether this was his work, because we know that the Confessio, the original, we don't have. What we have is something that was written 150 or so years later. So we're not too sure how much of that was embellished. In it, we're led to believe that he said, I came in God's strength and had nothing to fear. But it is likely that he was supported by the equivalent of the Underground Railroad. For instance, at the time, there were lots of people ending up in Ireland, and one of the possibilities of leaving Ireland was if somebody paid a ransom for you. So that meant people would arrive in Ireland trying to find out where you were, who had you, and with details of a ransom offer. So there was an infrastructure there for certain things to happen, but also there may well have been activities that helped people escape. Now, significantly, in the 6 years that he was there, it is said that he became fluent in the Irish language. He learned a lot about Ireland, our history and culture, and he obviously developed an affinity towards the people of Ireland. And we know that because he talks about wanting to come back to Ireland. So how did he get out? Well, when he arrived on the coast, he approached a ship that was loading a cargo of Irish hounds. At the time, Irish wolfhounds and various other hounds were very, very valuable and were much in demand in Rome and various other centers within Europe. So he approached the captain, who turned him away. And Patrick tells us then that he walked away and started praying. And apparently at some point, some of the sailors came after him and said, okay, we'll take you on board. We'll take you in trust. Probably what happened there was he had told them about his skills with handling animals, and he may have been the one thing that allowed them to make the decision that they would take him and take the risk. He also tells us that he traveled for 3 days, and what he found was devastation. So why was there devastation? Well, at the time, at this stage, Britain, the island of Britain, and modern day France, Gaul, and various other parts of Western Europe had been Christianized because they had been taken over by the Romans. And at this stage, the Roman the Romans had adopted Christianity as the official religion of the empire. So people in those areas were Christian. Now you had Germanic peoples then who were pagan. They were fleeing in front of the Huns. Hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of them were trying to escape. The river Rhine froze in 407 and they were able to cross. And that's the reason for the devastation. Patrick tells us that they couldn't find anything to eat, and the captain taunted him and said to him, "How about it, Christian? You say your God is all powerful. In other words, find us some food." And just around then, what happened was some pigs just appeared out of nowhere, and that sorted out their problems, because there was no way that they were going to kill and eat any of those dogs, because those dogs were more valuable than a man, or probably multiple men. So he left that group at some stage. We don't know why. We know that around this time he was also kidnapped and taken as a slave somewhere on the continent, but he escaped after 2 weeks. So he then he wanted to get back to Britain. So he had a choice. He could go back the route he had come across that devastated land, or he could go around the coast. And that's likely what happened. Significantly, at that stage, the abbot Honoratus was constructing a monastery on the island of Lérins, which is where the modern day Cannes is, where the International Film Festival is. He was first of all trying to clear the land so that he could build a monastery. And he was only given the land because nobody else wanted it, because it was uninhabitable, is the way they portray it. It was full of snakes and reptiles. There's a book written by a woman, Hamilton, and what she writes in her book, she says, Honoratus was winning a reputation for driving its booming population of vipers into the sea. And in her book, she writes that it is not impossible or unreasonable to assume that Patrick might have sought refuge on Lérins. So we know that there was never any snakes in Ireland, and we know that he never got rid of real snakes in Ireland. What probably happened is, when he did arrive back to Ireland and with his entourage, at the end of the day's work, they would probably be sitting around the fireplace, talking, as people used to do. And he probably entertained them by telling him stories about his work clearing snakes. And over time, that took on a life of its own. And maybe as part of the Christian narrative, when it was written, maybe somebody thought it would be a good idea to try to claim that he did that in Ireland, or somebody got confused. We don't know. Anyway, he did get home, and his parents obviously were happy to see him, didn't want him to leave, but he wanted a career. He wanted to make his life in the church, and he wanted to get back to Ireland. So eventually, he heard this voice. As I said earlier on, seeing things, hearing things, dreaming things was a common narrative. So what he says in his own work, he says, "I saw a man coming, as it were, from Ireland. His name was Victoricus." And we know Victoricus was a real person, and was somebody that Patrick had known when he was in Ireland. And he carried many letters, and he gave me one of them. I read the heading, "The Voice of the Irish." So as I began the letter, I imagined in that moment that I heard the voice of those very people who were near the wood of Holyoke, which is beside the Western Sea, and I cried out, "We appeal to you, holy servant boy, to come and walk among us." So that was the basis on which he entertained the idea and the motivation to come to Ireland. So let's step back a little minute and talk about Ireland and Christianity. Now, as you know, the Christian church is a much divided church. And in the 3rd and 4th century, those divisions were, real and very, very, very strong. And unfortunately, to this day, in Ireland, the Roman Catholic Church will insist that before Patrick arrived, Christianity hadn't arrived in Ireland. What they're really saying is that, okay, there might have been something in Ireland before the Roman Church came, and they might have called themselves Christians, but we declared them heretics. And as you know, heretics are worse than pagans. So we do know from other sources that the Christian church had been established possibly in the 1st century. For instance, St. James, who was alive during the time of Jesus, he visited Ireland, and when he left, he left his father Zebedee behind, and they began an organization in Ireland. And just as an aside, if you go to Guinness's, where do you go? Well, you go through St. James's Gate. Down the road from that is St. James's Hospital. Now, what's significant about St. James's Gate is that between the 8th or 9th century and around the 14th century, people used to go on pilgrimages to Spain, because St. James is the patron saint of Spain. And there's lots of connections as well with Ireland, independently of St. James. So there was a dual reason why people would want to go. So they used to meet at what is now St. James's Gate, and they used to get, if they were sick or ill or whatever, they would get treated in a building which over centuries then became St. James's Hospital. So there are certain things that we do know, because we know that the Christian church in Ireland was, again, different from the church in Rome. And the reason for that was because of the teachings of St. John. He had spread the word of Christ to Africa and Asia. So St. John and St. James were very, very significant in the early development of the church in Ireland. And we know that because some of the practices and some of the beliefs differed from Rome. The main one would have been over the dating of Easter. So when Patrick came, he wanted to get the dating of Easter to be the way that Rome wanted it, whereas the tradition in Ireland was different. Also, things like the haircut, believe it or not, was a significant difference between the two, and they're just two of the issues, but they indicate, that there was an earlier tradition in Ireland, and the new tradition then, if you like, clashed with that. Then there's Irish legends and the annals. We know, for example, that the High King Cormac MacNessa, who was alive in the time of Christ, what happened here was that his military commander, who had been fighting against the Romans, was imprisoned. And on the day that Christ was being crucified, the Romans decided that they would have it witnessed by a representative from every nation on earth. So this military commander, who would have been a high status because of that, he was brought out along with others to witness this. We don't know how he got back to Ireland, but he did. And he went to the king and he outlined what had happened. And Cormac was so upset and grieving that he jumped up, started ranting and raving. Problem for Cormac was that sometime previously he had got a piece of shrapnel in his skull, and of course he ended up dying of a brain bleed. A couple of 100 years later, Cormac MacArt, another High King in Ireland, possibly one of the most important ones, he died. But the reason that we're told or led to believe is that the Druids, who were the high priests of the pagan religion, they are said to have arranged for his death because Cormac had converted to Christianity in 366, which was 65, 66 years before Patrick arrived in Ireland. The other thing that I'll leave with you is, what are the most famous Irish boys' names in Ireland? It's not Peter and Paul, it's Sean and Seamus. Sean is John, Seamus is James. So who were these people that were in Ireland before St. Patrick? And we know they're there because they're saints. Albie, Declan, Kieran, and Iberus. At this point in time, all of these people were saints, including Patrick. They weren't made saints by Rome. At the time, being made a saint by Rome didn't happen, for about, let's see, 700 years after Patrick was alive. So in those intervening hundreds of years, you were made a saint by acclamation. The people around you, people in where you worked, elevated you to the status of sainthood. Now, some of the early Irish Christian development, of course, has to be explained, and is explained by the relationship of Ireland to the Roman Empire. As I said earlier, the people, the Celts in Ireland had been driven from the lands in Europe, so they didn't have a lot of time for Rome, and they had been fighting Rome. And of course, they would have looked with suspicion at Patrick as well, because if he was coming from Rome, because the Roman Empire was still in existence, the Roman Empire didn't fall for quite a while after Patrick came to Ireland. So he would have been representing the official religion of the Roman Empire, which the Celts had very, very good reason not to trust and to fight against. So he had, he had a lot of work to do in Ireland to convince them to let him do that work. So let's have a look quickly at how the church became the official religion of the Roman Empire. For the first 3 centuries, most of the popes had been killed as part of the persecutions. And around the year 250, persecutions became empire-wide. Then something strange happened on the island of Britain. Constantine, who was the leader of the Romans in that part of the world, was acclaimed by his troops as emperor. And sometimes this happened because the soldiers obviously, had a lot of power because of the work that they did. And they did not like the fact that there were people in Rome, sitting on chairs, drinking wine, overeating with food and whatever, while they were out getting killed. So every now and again, you had these internal shifts of power. Now, the problem for Constantine, of course, was that now that his troops had elevated him, he needed to be able to get to Rome, defeat all the others who might be thinking of claiming that they were emperor, or they had a greater right to be the emperor than him. So he needed an army. So my belief is that what happened was that he did a deal with Christians in Britain and in Gaul and anywhere else that there were Christians, that if you fight with me and we win, I will end the discrimination against Christians. And that's what happened. Eventually, within a short period of time after he became emperor, he had made, he'd first of all decriminalized it, and then within the next 70 years or so, Christianity was made the official religion in the year 380, a few years before Patrick was born. And just as an aside, Germanic forces, when they sacked Rome in 410, that was a big problem, obviously, if Rome was under attack. So they had to call all their troops back, so that including the ones from Britain. And that was the last time that Rome withdrew and did not replace its soldiers. And then, of course, in 476, then the Goth Odoacer, he forced the Romulus Augustus, who was the last Western Roman emperor, to abdicate. But by this stage, Patrick was an old man, and he had managed to do his work in Ireland, and the Christian mission in Ireland had been growing, even though the Western Roman Empire was still in existence. So in 380, the Edict of Thessalonica, it made Nicene Christianity the state church of the Roman Empire. Now, the Nicene Christianity was called that after the Nicene Creed. It was called that after the synod that was held in Nicene in the year 325. And it was at that meeting, which had been called by Constantine, who wanted to try to unify the different churches. Problem was, he wasn't able to successfully do that. And the decision that was made then was that if you're not with us, you're against us. So anyone who didn't take the lead from the Nicene Christianity, who with the backing of the Roman emperor, obviously were in a strong position. So everybody else was basically kicked out of the Christian world, and they were known and called heretics. They then added the term Catholic to replace the Nicene. And Catholic is just a word for universal, because they wanted it to be everywhere. And that then provided the impetus for church leaders in Rome to assert their dominance over the various branches of the church around the world. Significantly then, in the year 429, just a couple of years before Patrick arrived in Ireland, the Pope sent his leading man in Europe, Saint Germanus. He sent him to Britain. At the time in Britain, there was what would be described as a heresy. The church there, or at least a significant part of the church, was not supportive of the Roman position on various issues, particularly, original sin. So what happened was Germanus went, sat down, discussed whatever, and made a deal with those who were prepared to go the route of him and Rome. The others who didn't were exiled, and most of those went to Ireland. And I'll be moving on now to talk about, why did Ireland become so important for Rome? One of the reasons was to do with the fact that you had, a significant number of leading Christians exiling themselves to Ireland. So who else in Ireland as Christians? Well, some of the slaves, particularly those who were abducted in Christian countries, from Britain and Gaul. So that was a significant part of the slave population. There would have been Irish mercenary soldiers fighting for Rome. Sometimes they would have been fighting against Rome because in its nature, mercenary soldiers would fight for whoever pays them. The only issue there is that while they were away, some of them may have converted through marriage or whatever, and then come back with spouses and with family. Then, of course, there was a lot of trading. So traders and other free Irish people may have converted. And then we do know that people like, the missionaries at the time, because they weren't saints yet, Albie, Declan, Iver, Kieran, and many more, they were doing their work and they were converting people in Ireland. And then, of course, with the arrival now, as a result of the depredations of the Germanic pagan tribes, Christians were being forced out of Christian areas on Western Europe, and there was no point in them going east. Although some may have, but it's reasonable to assume that quite a significant number of them came, and they would have come with skills, with resources, and all of that helped in the next number of centuries. Because remember, over the next 3 or 4 centuries, Ireland was known as the Ireland of saints and scholars. While the rest of Europe went into the Dark Ages, Ireland had a massive renaissance. And a lot of that was due to the skills and resources that came in at this time. So how did he convert the Irish, or the people in Ireland? And it was a difficult job, as I said earlier, because he was in a territory where there was no good reason why the Irish people, or the people who were Irish in Ireland, who were Celts, there's no good reason why they would want, initially anyway, to go with him. So he says in his work, he says, daily I am expecting to be slain or set upon or reduced to slavery. The way Cardinal Cushing put it, and I think this is a good way of explaining everything that I've told you up to now. He said, it was in an era of alarming crisis that Pope Celestine I sent Patrick to Ireland, an era of confusion and disorder and chaos. And that kind of summarizes what I've just told you. So what was his role? Well, a year before Patrick, the Pope had sent another person, Palladius. That mission failed, and Patrick was sent to replace him. Now, Patrick had been looking, to be sent, but for a lot of reasons, partly to do with his lack of education, and it took him over 20 years, to be able to get to the point, where he would be made a priest. Then there was a much more difficult task ahead for him to be made a bishop. And it is likely that what happened was that after Palladius's issue in Ireland, in the sense that somebody from Rome had to go there to sort it out, otherwise there was a real possibility that Ireland would develop as a Christian country, but not in the tradition of Rome. So they needed to get somebody there. And Patrick probably was able to convince them that he was the only man capable of doing that because he could speak the language, he'd been there, he knew people over there and whatever. So it's likely that that helped him. Now, his primary role was to align the Christian community in Ireland with Rome. The Christian narrative, the Roman church narrative, is that he was sent to Ireland to strengthen the local Christian community. Strengthen meaning, to convince them that Rome was the best option out of the available options. And as we know, the community at this time is a mix of converted Irish, Christian slaves, refugees, asylum seekers. He spent about 20 years. And as I said, he was initially confined to the role as a brother due to his lack of education. And eventually he was allowed up. Now, in a few slides back, I talked to you about St. Germanus, who had been given the job to go to the island of Britain and to deal with the issues there with the ecclesiastical authorities. So one of the things that came out of that meeting was that if anybody was to go to Ireland, it had to be done with the approval of the British ecclesiastical authorities. Now, they did not favor the promotion of Patrick, but essentially they didn't have a veto. And this, if you keep that in mind, it'll help when I get, to the later stage of his life, when he was in conflict with the British ecclesiastical authorities. Some of it goes back to this, it was against what they would say was against their best judgment to allow Patrick to win because of his lack of education and other qualifications. So Cardinal Cushington tells us that when he arrived in the community, he brought with him a retinue consisting of never less than 24 persons, often up to 100. The group usually included an assistant bishop, a chaplain, several young men whom Patrick was preparing for the priesthood, a brehon or judge, because a brehon is just the Irish word for judge, to advise him on legal matters, builders, masons, smiths, metalworkers, chariot and wagon drivers, a cook, a brewer, and 2 table attendants. Also, there were a sacristan, 3 embroidery workers, and there was a palmist who would be the custodian of the sacred books. It is thought that he may have supplemented his church resources with some family and personal wealth. But what we do know for sure is that when he did establish himself, that wealthy Irish nobility, particularly women, provided resources for his work. Some of you may have read the book by Cahill called How the Irish Saved Civilization. So this is the way he explains Patrick's mission and how he came here. He says, because of his knowledge of the Irish language and culture, he was sent to provide support to the Christian slaves and converts, starting in Northern Ireland, partly because that's where he had originally come from, he'd originally been, but also because of the work of the Irish missionaries who did not want him coming into the southern part of Ireland. Now, just as a quick aside, one of the things he wanted to do in Northern Ireland, he actually wanted to go to the king that he had absconded from, and he went there with the intention of refunding him the loss he had suffered as a result of him absconding. But the story goes anyway that when Miliach heard that Patrick was coming, his belief in paganism was such that he feared so much that Patrick, would do something to him, that he set a funeral pyre, set it on fire, and plunked himself on it, and that was the end of him. Carl also suggests that Patrick would have sought permission from the local kings, because he needed to get on their side if he was going to get anywhere, because at this time in Ireland there was no such thing as free property. Everything was owned by local chieftains, so you couldn't just take a piece of land and you couldn't just plonk yourself on it. You had to get approval. He did convert some kings, and obviously that made his work easier. Another book that I reference is by Freeman, and he suggested Patrick succeeded by using a slow and steady approach with a careful eye on the practical politics of Irish society. And he tells us in his own work, he made payments to local kings to gain their favor and protection. And of course, the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain were very, very upset about about that. They didn't think that that was the way to do it. But Patrick, his argument would be, if I'm going to get anywhere, I'm going to have to get them on my side. The other side of him making payments to that, the gripe from the ecclesiastical authorities in Britain was, instead of giving the local kings that money, you should have been sending it over to us. Now, we do know that Patrick, it is clear from the history that we do have, is that he either chose not to be confrontational or dogmatic, or that's just the way it worked out. And it was believed that that was the case because he wanted to demonstrate that Christian morality and principles was good. And the best way that he could demonstrate that was to show that that's how he approached his own work. Now, first of all, paganism, had been rooted in Ireland for, long time, thousands of years. So it was a very strong religion, and it was a religion. The high priests were very, very powerful, in Ireland. Now we know that Patrick, along with the various other missionaries, we know that despite the strength of paganism, that they managed to spread Christian teachings, and they did that through preaching, writing, and performing countless baptisms. Now, there was one particular thing that kind of helped them in their, when they talked to people who are pagans. They didn't have to explain, the whole notion of transcendentalism. They already believed in the hieroincarnation, so there was lots of things that they already understood. Patrick, he recognized the history of spiritual practices, the nature-oriented rituals, and he incorporated many of those into the church practices. When he chose, places to be important, they were important to pagans. Dates on the calendar were dates that were also important to the pagans. So it's very practical in his approach. So this is, I suppose, the Patrick's Cross is where we see the combining of the sun worshipping ideology of the pagans with the Christian. So that's best example that we have. So Patrick, he established bishops throughout Northern, Central, and Eastern Ireland. Now, what he had to do, rather than set up the parish and diocesan system that he would have liked, he basically had to accept the reality that in Ireland, the different clans had their lands. So they then became the borders for the dioceses that were set up. And he worked with that. Because he was the representative from Rome, obviously he then was the highest ranking bishop in Ireland. And he also made Latin then the ecclesiastical language. What's interesting about Ireland is that there were no church martyrs from his time. And that would indicate that the pagan rulers allowed him to carry out his mission. Now, one of the books that are referred to, again, it tells us that on more than one occasion that he alludes to persecution. He declares that he expects martyrdom, and he welcomes the prospect. So that just gives an idea of, if you like, how he felt about working in Ireland at the time. Now, by the time that he died, Ireland had not become fully converted, and the secular authorities in Ireland had not adopted Christianity. Now, Patrick, he supported church officials, he created councils, he founded monasteries, and he organized Ireland into the diocese based around the clan boundaries that were in Ireland. One of the interesting things was that by the 6th century, there was a law that laid down a code of conduct for Christians towards their pagan neighbors. And that was good because basically what they were saying was, we have to live together. And there has to be an acceptance, that if we are going to convert people, we're going to have to do it the right way. Now, Cardinal Cushing, in his book, he tells us that the whole island was Catholic, but we don't see the evidence for that. But we are happy that with the numbers that are quoted, and from various other sources, that there was 350 bishops, there was 5,000 priests ordained, and 700 churches built. So you can imagine the building boom that would have been in Ireland at the time. So now I want to move on to the writings of St. Patrick. Now, the first thing about these are that we don't have the originals. What we have are copies that were written down in the, between 100 and 200 years later. Now, we know that they were written down around the time that the origin story for the church was being written. So we're not too sure, how much embellishments were done. We know that the basic story will be true, but again, there would have been embellishments put in, but it's very, very hard. It's the same with the legends from Ireland. We know they're based upon true stories, but again, there's a lot of embellishments that go on. So it's a skill in itself to be able to take documents from so far back and to figure out what can be accepted as real and what is just an indicator of what was going on. So the first letter he wrote was called A Letter to the Soldiers of Coroticus. Now, what had happened here was that he had just converted a whole village on the northeast of Ireland, and he moved on then to go to another village. A messenger came after him to alert him to the fact that the soldiers of Coroticus had arrived, and they had kidnapped and taken away all of these newly baptized people and taken them off to Britain to be sold on the slave market. So Patrick now at this stage was in a bit of a quandary, because all of the time that he was there, the pagans were just hoping that something would happen that would either show him to be a phony, or that somehow or another that he would be shown to be somebody who couldn't be relied upon, that he would essentially score an own goal. So when this happened, he knew he was on the spot. He had to do something. Now, protocol at the time would have been for him to contact the authorities in Britain, but he knew that to do that would take too much time, and that by then all of these people would have been dispersed across the globe as slaves. So he decided, well, first of all, he sent people over with an offer of a ransom, and essentially they were told, you better get back, or we're going to hold on to you as well. So then he decides to write a letter, and it was to go, because the soldiers of Coroticus were Christian. Coroticus was a Christian. The people that had been kidnapped were Christian. So he was trying to put pressure on Coroticus by getting his soldiers, or some of them anyway, to think about what had just happened. The problem, though, was that Coroticus was probably also providing protection for a lot of the church officials in the area, and Patrick knew that. So the letter essentially has been described this way. It was at once a decree of excommunication. In other words, if they didn't do the right thing, if Coroticus did not do the right thing, he would be excommunicated. And in the world at that time, if you were excommunicated from the church, you could not lead your soldiers. The soldiers wouldn't accept you. So he thought that was going to work. It was also a heartfelt plea, a carefully argued sermon, a word of comfort to his Irish followers because they were very upset, and a powerful prayer. So he sent copies to Coroticus, the soldiers, the church leaders in Britain and around Ireland. Now, the significance of this was that the British ecclesiastical authorities were very, very upset about this, very angry about this, because he had broken protocol. And they had been looking for opportunities as well to get at him, because right from the beginning, they were not happy that he got this posting, if you like. So what happened then over the next few years was a lot of back and forth and name calling and whatever. So he ended up being called to England for a review, and he decided he wasn't going to go because he figured if he went, they'd never let him come back. So he wrote a letter instead, and that's what's called the Confessio. And it's called after the last few words in the letter, because he says at the end of it that the letter is his confession or Confessio before death. So he wrote it because of what was going on with the British church. The review, his character and work were attacked. He was accused of corruption, of having ulterior motives in coming to Ireland, was stated to be unfit for his job, largely to do with his lack of education. He was accused of being gone native, and they used things like, they called him a filthy little pig keeper. So the Confessio, it is a selective story. It was designed to show that he was chosen by the grace of God to serve selflessly among the Irish, and he goes through his life, his boyhood, slavery, his escape from Ireland, etc., etc. And they were all included to convince the readers that he, like the Apostle Paul, was selected by God and guided by him in his work, because that was the greatest call you could make, that God chose you. So this is the way he put it. He says, listen to me well, all of you, great and small, everyone who has any fear of God, especially you wealthy landowners so proud of your education. So that was the first dig at them. Listen and consider carefully. God chose foolish little me from among all of you who seem so wise and so expert in the law and so powerful in your eloquence. Basically saying to them, yeah, I don't have all of these things, you have them, but still, God picked me. He picked ignorant Patrick ahead of all of you, even though I am not worthy. He picked me to go forward with fear and reverence and without any of you complaining at the time. And of course, this was another dig at them, because while they weren't happy about the fact that they had to rubber stamp his appointment, they really didn't make much of a deal of it. They didn't complain too much about it because it didn't really give him a chance of success, partly because he had no track record. He didn't have the high standard of education and whatever else that was needed. And they believed that, just like Palladius, that the Irish would literally toss him out within a couple of days or whatever, and possibly even kill him. So he said, yeah, you didn't complain at the time because you didn't believe, that I was going to be successful. But now that I'm successful, you want to take that all from me. So he died in a place that's now known as Downpatrick, called after him. But of course, this happened in the 12th century. And he's said to be buried alongside St. Bridget and St. Columba, although that's never been proven. So I'm going to finish off with just a couple of things. I'm going to summarize this section here on St. Patrick's Day celebrations. So the celebrations began around the 9th century, and it began with Irish scholars who were on the continent. What had happened around this time was that the Vikings had invaded Ireland, and they had destroyed all of the monastic settlements. And a lot of the people who were in those monastic settlements had either been killed or had been sold as slaves. Some of them had escaped, and they had fortunately had managed to bring to the continent a lot of the very valuable works with them. So when they got over there, they started off an incredible number of educational institutions based around the, if you like, the refugees from Ireland. And they decided that they were going to then celebrate and use Patrick as the basis of the celebration. So he became a symbol of Ireland for all of those in exiles. So let's see. It wasn't until Luke Wadding in the 1600s that St. Patrick's feast day was placed on the universal liturgical calendar. And of course, then it became a holy day of obligation for Roman Catholics in Ireland. But significantly, it was also a feast day in the Church of Ireland, which is part of the worldwide Anglican communion. So until the 1700s, it was celebrated predominantly in Ireland. The earlier period, the 9th and 10th century, that used to be a 3-day event, but it kind of died down over the years. So now, by 1700s, it was a somber religious occasion spent mainly in prayer, as against what it is today. Significantly in the 18th century, during the penal laws, Irish people saw that as a way in which they could promote Irish culture and tradition by celebrating St. Patrick and by wearing a shamrock, which is a symbol for Ireland. That was their act of defiance. And the authorities were, because the Church of Ireland also celebrated it, they really couldn't come down on the Irish. So that was a way that they did that. And of course, around 1916 and the years running up to 1916, again, St. Patrick's Day was a big day for people to come out in military style and parade in every city and town in Ireland. The green color has only been associated from the 1640s. Originally, it used to be blue. Then in 1903, it became an official public holiday in Ireland. You know, the initial celebrations were a bit rowdy. So laws were introduced then requiring the public houses to be shut down. And that continued then until the 1970s. Now, the first St. Patrick's Day parade in Ireland was in Waterford in 1903. And then, as I said, in 1916, there was a major parade by the Irish Volunteers. And the authorities recorded 38 St. Patrick's Day parades involving 6,000 martyrs. Almost half of them were said to have been armed. Let me see, I'll move on here. Celebrations in the US. Well, the world's first recorded St. Patrick's Day celebration was in St. Augustine, Florida in the year 1600. And he also, Michael Phronesis, he discovered that the first St. Patrick's Day parade was also in St. Augustine. And then we know that Boston and New York had been associated with early parades and celebrations. And we know also on the 17th of March, which was Evacuation Day, Washington, for that day, he set the password and countersign for safe re-entry into the city as Boston and St. Patrick. And then we know as well that Washington in 1780, he allowed his troops holiday on March the 17th, and that became known as the St. Patrick's Day encampment of 1780. Now, by the late 1860s, over a dozen American cities had large parades. And just 10 years later, the Irish were the majority in the population in New York. And of course, that's the basis on which the Patrick's Day parade there. And then it spread, you know, to anywhere that there was Irish people all over the world. Now, his crozier, which was a symbol of, you know, his authority. It is said, it is claimed that he had been given this when he was on a visit to the Middle East. The claim is that it was actually a staff that Jesus had at one stage. So it was a very elaborate one because he got made by his companion, the goldsmith Assicus or Saint Tussock. So he made it good. So it became a national relic. And it was described by Saint Bernard as one that it was covered with gold and adorned with the most costly of gems. Also, we know that oaths and treaties were signed on it, and it survived storms and invasions, but it didn't survive the Reformation. It was tragically and sacrilegiously destroyed during Henry VIII's Reformation. It was burnt in public in front of Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin. Now, the only nation outside of Ireland that celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a national holiday is Montserrat, which is an island in the Caribbean. It's known as the Emerald Isle of the Caribbean. And it was first populated by Irish and African peoples during the 1650s, when the Irish were being transported out of Ireland during the period of Cromwell. So that's all I've got for you tonight. I'm sorry about the breakdown. I'm not too sure what happened there. So I teach Irish history courses, and in case any of you are interested, I can be contacted through my email address there, seanmurphy630@gmail.com. Now, the courses, obviously, some of these are already done in March. The history of County Down and the Easter Rising of 1916. Now, all my classes are recorded, so the recordings are available, as is the PowerPoint presentations. Then next month, I'm doing the county that's adjacent to County Down, County Antrim. And then I'm moving on into chronological history to deal with the rise of Sinn Féin and the War of Independence. I have some resources here at the end, and there's a very good movie that was made in 1999 with Alan Bates, Susanna York, Emmett Bergen, and it's well worth looking. You can get it free on YouTube. And there's a kids movie. There's some bibliographies that are again referenced here for you. So if you want a copy of it, There's a copy available from the library. You can get a copy from me. Okay, well then, if there's no questions, I will bid you all good night and wish you all a happy St. Patrick's Day tomorrow. Thank you, and so happy St. Patrick's Day.